Trump is enraged. He is not present when international leaders are together in China. No role, no invitation, all disdain. This is the man who formerly boasted that he was personally buddies with Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping. He referred to it as friendship during his first term. He stated he could negotiate a deal by calling them at any time. However, those times are over. There are no longer any handshakes or grins. Leaders who have grown weary of threats and are unwilling to must comply with Washington's regulations. Everything became crystal evident following the latest SEO summit. Kim and Putin did not return home. To meet Xi, they immediately traveled to Beijing. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a purposeful display of solidarity directed at Washington. When Trump saw it, he responded angrily, accusing them of conspiring against the U.S. One conclusion has emerged after years of tariffs, sanctions, and the America First agenda. We can no longer trust the United States. Washington has no place in the future that these nations are creating. Thus, the question is quite straightforward. Is Trump becoming less in charge of the global order? As new partnerships emerge in Asia, is the United States being marginalized? For this reason, we must examine the ways in which the global influence landscape is evolving. In China, the victory parade was more than just a march of banners and soldiers. It united the very nations that Washington has always viewed as its principal adversaries. Standing China unveiled its most cutting-edge weaponry, including mobile launchers, swarms of drones, vast columns of armored vehicles, submarine-launched nuclear missiles, and shoulder-to-shoulder displays of power and togetherness. As they marched in perfect formation, row after row of troops exuded might and discipline. It was an obvious message. China no longer makes an effort to catch up. It positions itself as an equal that is prepared to take on American military might. The hypersonic missiles were the true shock. Tens of billions of dollars worth of aircraft carrier groups can be demolished in a matter of minutes. From Guam to South Korea, even bases that were formerly believed to be safely safeguarded now appear to be at risk. The procession isn't the only thing at stake. It started to represent a change. Washington is finding it more and more difficult to fulfill its commitments to defend friends like Japan or the Philippines as the balance of power in Asia shifts. The dangers are just too great. Beijing has stated unequivocally that the U.S. no longer has unchallenged military dominance in the Pacific. What is most concerning to Washington today, China is known for both its expansion and its capacity to stand by its allies in times of need. Sanctions were America's and its allies' preferred weapon for many years. The reasoning was straightforward. When a nation is cut off from markets and money, its economy implodes. However, China has changed the regulations. In addition to protecting itself, it established lifelines for Russia and North Korea. First, let's discuss North Korea. Pyongyang was subjected to sanctions by the U.S. and the G7 for many years. The fuel was limited, trade barred, and bank accounts frozen. It appeared to be an iron curtain on paper. However, North Korea remained intact. The explanation is straightforward. China. Currently, Beijing handles almost 98% of North Korea's formal trade. That's nearly everything. It is the source of food, fuel, medicine, and spare parts. The amount of trade hit $2 billion in 2023 alone. The majority of it is imported. North Korea's economy would implode in a matter of weeks without this lifeline. Kim's dictatorship can endure with it forever. Now, Russia's economic collapse was anticipated when the United States and Europe applied the harshest sanctions following the invasion of Ukraine. Financial catastrophe, mass unemployment, and a double-digit GDP contraction were all forecast by Western banks. However, China intervened once more, and the predictions were incorrect. Russia's economy expanded at 3.6% in 2023 rather than collapsing. The explanations are obvious: stable energy exports, domestic demand, and military spending. The growth slowed by 2025, but continued to be favorable at about 1.5%. After rising to 9%, inflation is now steadily declining and may reach 4% by the end of 2026. That is, Russia adjusted. They even reversed the ruble. While the dollar started to falter, the currency that many Western analysts had written off increased by almost 40% in a single year. Over $37 trillion is now owed by the U.S. Loan interest is eating up the finances. Investors are wondering how long this will continue. Countries such as Saudi Arabia and Brazil are publicly looking for alternatives, and demand for U.S. bonds is declining. The basis of dollar domination seems to be faltering for the first time in decades. Washington utilized the dollar as a weapon for a long time. Countries who violated the rules risked having their reserves frozen or being removed from the SWIFT system. As long as there was no way to get around the dollar, this worked. China and Russia, however, are developing a different system. Over $240 billion is currently traded annually between them, and the majority of the dollar is no longer used for transactions. Rupees and yuan are used for settlements. Weapons, food, gas, and oil are traded outside of the U.S. currency's reach. It's not just business either. It is an intentional effort to challenge U.S. financial hegemony. In the meantime, Russian energy keeps running in spite of limitations and price caps. Oil is transported throughout the world by a vast shadow fleet of tankers, frequently exceeding the $60 limit, and billions are sent back to Moscow. Meanwhile, the Power of Siberia 2 project is proceeding and is expected to provide 50 billion cubic meters of gas are produced in China each year. This one pipeline, which is completely outside the jurisdiction of Washington and Brussels, will link the two economies for 10 years, ensuring cheap fuel for Chinese manufacturers and exports for Russia. The picture is much more dire when viewed in a broader context. North Korea, China, Russia, and Iran are enlarging their alliance, which is already known as the CRG. This is a parallel system of trade and mutual assistance, not merely a formality. According to reports, North Korea has already provided Russia with soldiers and weapons in return for funds, equipment, and instruction. Moscow receives drones from Iran. China receives gas from Russia. And Beijing closes holes in international markets to prevent penalties from choking its allies. An economy that is not dependent on the U.S. or the G7 is gradually emerging. It is this fact that Washington does not like to accept. Sanctions, which were formerly the primary means of exerting pressure, are becoming less effective. The influence of each successive wave decreases, and solutions to every limitation are swiftly discovered. Beijing has demonstrated its ability to mitigate Western strikes for both its allies and itself. And an unsettling query comes up. What leverage does the United States have left if sanctions are no longer effective? America depended on its capacity to isolate adversaries and compel compromises for many years. That system is failing today. Washington was at the center of a global economic system that is gradually being dismantled, in addition to resistance to sanctions. At the same time, the United States is suffering as China, Russia, and North Korea get closer. Trump's originally intended to target Beijing. Tariffs on Chinese imports ultimately impacted the United States. Consumer costs have increased as a result of businesses paying more for imported materials and components. A portion of that enormous market has been lost for farmers who formerly exported grain, pig, and soy to China. What was portrayed as employment protection has turned into an issue for important industries. Beijing is heading in the opposite direction as Washington's trade relations deteriorate. China is growing. It has improved economic ties with Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, and Russia. These changes are no longer merely speculative. These changes in trade flows are real. The gas pipeline between Russia and China is a notable example. Although it was only on paper for years, construction is now moving more quickly. Up to 50 billion cubic meters of gas per year will be supplied to China once it is operational. This ensures revenue for Moscow in spite of sanctions. It gives Beijing's factories reliable and affordable fuel. Losing dominance over the world energy market, the US and Europe continue to play a supporting role. However, energy is just one aspect of the situation. China is making its mark in areas that were formerly dominated by Washington through the Belt and Road Initiative. Highways in South Asia, railroads in Latin America, and new ports in Africa are more than just building projects. These are enduring connections that bind nations to Beijing. China prioritizes business in contrast to the U.S., which bases aid on political considerations. Leaders tired of American speeches about democracy and human rights will find this appealing. It has a cumulative impact. Each pipeline, port, and railroad enhances China's position as a major global exchange. With each additional U.S. tariff, nations move closer to Beijing. U.S. policies has expedited the development of alternative systems where America has virtually no influence, rather than undermining China. The U.S. is compelled to raise military spending every year in order to preserve its standing in Asia. Billions are invested on missile defense systems, new airplanes, and contemporary ships. However, American forces no longer seem as impregnable as they once did in spite of these massive expenditures. Every time China introduces a new weapon system or missile in response, Washington increases its defense budget even further. Though it sounded loud, Trump's tirade accusing Kim, Putin, and Xi Jinping of plotting revealed more. It seems like a sign of uncertainty to a man who has based his political career on projecting an image of power and dominance. In essence, he confirmed what many others had already observed. The U.S. is losing influence more quickly than Washington is prepared to acknowledge. Additionally, Trump's go-to line, "Only I can negotiate," is ineffective this time. Kim, Putin, and Xi don't require the U.S. anymore. Mediation. They are creating a future without Washington at the table, writing their own deals and forming their own alliances. Click the bell and subscribe to the channel if you want to see where this entire transition is going. I'll see you in the upcoming video.